A large house on the outskirts of the city stood majestically, surrounded by a garden tended by a staff of gardeners. It had witnessed many stories behind its walls, and now, after the death of Alice's husband, it had become a place of peace and imprisonment. It seemed that every room, every corner reminded her of who she once was and who she might never be again. Alice Johnson had a large network of acquaintances and a reputation as a reliable partner who was always responsible for her decisions. But even those who had known her for many years did not realize that she had always been a lonely woman at heart. Businesses, meetings, social events, all of this was a necessary part of her life, but at the same time alienated her from real human feelings, from the love she never had enough of. Her daughter, Sophie, was one of the few joys in her life. Sophie was young, energetic, zest for life, passionate about learning, and in love with a young man who worked part-time at the college. His name was Josh. He was 7 years younger than Sophie, but that didn't bother them. She saw him as a friend and support, a person who was there for her in difficult moments, and together they planned their future together. Josh was a typical representative of his youth, with the confidence characteristic of young men, his age, who have not yet experienced the true burdens of life. He was attractive, athletic, with dark hair and a look that could easily charm anyone. Sophie was proud to have him as her boyfriend, but it seemed that Josh was interested in more than just her studies and her support. The first meeting between Alice and Josh would be hard to call special. He just walked into the house with Sophie, said hello, asked her how she was doing, and then they went for a quick walk. But in that moment, the subtle way Josh looked at Alice, the way he burned her, made her feel something like excitement for the first time in years. Alice couldn't explain to herself what it was that drew her to Josh. Was it his youth or his spontaneity? Or the fact that he was the first to notice her as a woman and not as a business person or Sophie's mother? In the weeks that followed, Josh began to appear at their home more often. Sophie was busy studying for her exams and would often leave Josh with Alice for a few minutes while she got ready or looked for books in her room. One day, when Sophie had to stay late for class, Josh came home early to find only Alice at home. She was sitting on the terrace doing some work when he approached. Her barely contained excitement did not go unnoticed. Josh sat down in the chair opposite and, without further ado, began to ask her about her hobbies, her past travels, and her youth. "I didn't think young people were interested in such things," Alice said, smiling slightly. "Of course they are," he replied, looking directly at her. Soon they began a game of glances, cautious hints, which gave rise to strange but pleasant feelings in my heart. They exchanged small pleasantries that went beyond mere politeness. Sophie didn't notice anything, but the atmosphere in the house began to be filled with hidden tension. Josh and Alice's meetings became more frequent and less casual. On one of their visits, when Sophie was busy at the university, Alice invited Josh to stay for lunch. Their time together became longer, and gradually they began to reveal their secrets to each other. Alice told him about her youthful dreams, how she could not realize most of them because of the responsibility that fell on her shoulders after her husband's death. Josh listened attentively, and then spoke about his ambitions, his plans to break out of his ordinary life and find his place in the world. After that lunch, their communication changed forever. Josh began to come not only with Sophie, but also on his own, under the pretext of some business or career advice. He started leaving things in the house, his old sweater, a bottle of perfume that got lost in the dresser. He seemed to be marking the territory, leaving small traces of his presence. Each of his visits brought excitement and tension that Alice found fascinating. She felt like she was returning to her youth, when dreams and mysteries filled her heart. But somewhere deep inside there was a sense of danger, that all of this could one day be revealed, and then she risked losing everything: her home, her career, her relationship with her daughter. But each new meeting with him deepened her emotions. One day, when Sophie had to stay after classes at the university, Josh came home early again. Alice was preparing for an important meeting, but when she saw him at the door, she put her work on hold. She invited him in, and they had a cup of coffee together, talking about future plans, dreams, and life. Josh proved to be an attentive listener, And this seemed to fascinate Alice even more. Every question he asked made her feel important, as if there was someone in the world who really cared about how she felt. "Sometimes I feel like my whole life has been spent in continuous obligations," she admitted, looking at her coffee cup. "Every day it's the same thing, the same faces, the same routine. After my husband died, it became even harder. And I always dreamed of something different." Josh nodded, keeping his gaze on her. "You have the kind of life most people dream of," he said in a soft tone. "But, money and success are only part of the picture. Sometimes it seems like it doesn't matter how much we have if we don't have something real." Alice couldn't take her eyes off Josh. This conversation was rekindling a feeling in her that she had thought she had lost long ago. The feeling that someone understands her and accepts her exactly as she is, without obligations or social statuses. She couldn't stop thinking about the risk, about what would happen if Sophie found out. She wanted to feel alive here and now. Every day their meetings became more frequent and longer. When Josh came to visit, Alice looked younger and more cheerful. Sophie, of course, noticed the changes in her mother, but she perceived it as a natural reaction to the improvement in her emotional state after her father's death. She was even happy that her mother might have started to adapt to the new circumstances. However, Sophie noticed some strange little things. One day she saw Josh coming out of the kitchen with a cup that her mother usually used. In another situation, she noticed that his scarf had been left in her mother's room, and although these things could be chalked up to coincidence, she felt a certain amount of discomfort. Her gut instinct told her that something was going on, but she didn't want to believe it. She assured herself that it was just a coincidence, a mere fluke. Meanwhile, Alice was getting more and more immersed in these feelings that Josh was giving her. He was young, lively, and infinitely curious. He opened the door to a world she had long considered closed to her. Together they laughed, dreamed, shared moments that seemed to belong only to them. These moments helped her escape from her everyday life, and each time she fell more in love with this secret connection. During one of these meetings, Josh decided to give Alice a small but symbolic gift. It was a locket with the word "life" engraved on it. He told her that this medallion symbolized for him the opportunity to experience life to the fullest. Alice accepted it with warmth and gratitude, feeling that this moment would forever remain in her memory. The locket became a symbol of their connection, their secret world. But this closeness had its consequences. Sophie once found the medallion on the table in her mother's room and recognized something familiar in it, but could not understand why her mother would wear such a thing. She left the locket there, but the incident never left her mind. Her suspicions began to grow, and with them, her fear of losing someone she cared about. Soon, Josh, feeling more and more at risk, became more cautious, but no less enthusiastic. His attention to Alice became more intense, and they continued to meet in secret. He would come under a different pretext, often leaving little things like notes or small gifts hidden in places where only Alice could find them. These were the secret signs of their relationship, which gave Alice a sense of importance and meaning in life. Secrets, however, cannot remain hidden forever. Gradually, clues accumulated in Alice and Sophie's home that began to paint an incomprehensible picture for Sophie. The more she tried to ignore it, the harder it was to turn away from the obvious. One evening, when Sophie returned home later than usual, she found Josh and Alice eating dinner on the terrace. Her heart sank when she saw them looking at each other, and it seemed to her that this was not just a friendly conversation. Sophie tried to ignore it, but at the same time, her inner excitement grew into real anxiety. Later, when Alice and Josh were alone, she asked him if he thought they were taking too many risks. "Sophie is starting to suspect something," she said quietly, nervously twiddling her thumbs. "She won't know anything," Josh replied, taking her hand. "Only if we tell her ourselves." Their eyes met, and the moment lingered in the air as if frozen in time. Their connection became so deep that they could no longer stop. This secret intimacy had its own meaning, its own significance for both of them. And although they knew it was dangerous, their attraction to each other became more important to them than any risks. From that evening on, the situation in the house began to develop in a completely different way. Sophie noticed more and more little things: the smell of her mother's perfume on Josh's clothes, traces of her lipstick on his shirt, and it was becoming an overwhelming burden for her. She couldn't and didn't want to believe that this connection really existed, but subconsciously her inner voice told her that the truth was close. For Alice and Josh, every new meeting turned into a test. They knew their relationship was dangerous, but they couldn't bring themselves to stop. This connection had long since become more than just a game for them, but something more. Every moment, every glance, every word between them filled their hearts with a sense of life, of the real, and neither of them was ready to lose it. Weeks passed, and the tension in the Johnson household grew with each passing day. Sophie could no longer ignore the suspicions that were eating away at her from the inside. Details that had seemed insignificant before were now forming a single picture: her mother, Josh's mysterious signs of attention, and sleepless nights became a heavy burden that weighed on her every day. Alice and Josh, on the other hand, continued their forbidden affair as if the truth could still be hidden. Every moment they spent together seemed exciting, but also dangerous. Their secret meetings, sneaky glances, and words that could melt ice became a bond they could no longer live without. One evening, when Sophie stayed at the university for extra classes, Alice invited Josh to dinner. They set the table in the living room, exchanging smiles that promised them something special. The candlelight flickered, creating an atmosphere that made them forget about reality. "I think tonight is special," Josh said, putting his arm around Alice's shoulders. "No one will disturb us." "Just you and me," Alice replied, touching his face gently. They talked about everything that was important to them, about the future, about desires they could not realize, about dreams that always seemed unattainable. Every word, every touch was filled with feelings that made their existence complete at that moment. As dinner came to an end, they sat on the terrace, and the warm wind enveloped them as if to protect their secret. Josh took Alice's hand, looking her straight in the eye as the candlelight flickered on their faces. At that moment, they both seemed to be out of time. Suddenly the door creaked open and Alice looked up. Sophie was standing in the doorway, her face pale and her eyes full of tears. Her indignation and anger were hard to miss. She looked at Josh and Alice as if she were seeing them for the first time. She remained silent for a long time, exchanging glances with her mother, who was experiencing a mixed feeling of shame and fear. "How could you?" Sophie finally said, her voice trembling. "You, Mom? With him? With my boyfriend?" Alice was at a loss for words. She wanted to touch her daughter's hand to explain everything, but at that moment she was torn with internal pain. Sophie quickly pulled back to avoid her touch and cried loudly. Josh was also silent, not knowing how to justify himself. He could not look Sophie in the eye. He realized that their secret was no longer a secret, that their whole game was over, leaving only pain and bitterness. Sophie, unable to hold back her tears, ran out of the house, leaving her mother and Josh alone with their guilt. Alice remained sitting at the table, consumed by despair. She realized that everything had been destroyed: her bond with Sophie, her trust, and even the little happiness she had found in her relationship with Josh. Her heart was breaking with pain, and she felt she was alone with her bitter truth. Josh stood beside her, looking at her silently, but his gaze was cold and distant. "What now?" he asked, not daring to look her in the eye. "It's over, Josh. We can't go on. Sophie hates us, and I can't forgive myself for letting her down," Alice replied, trying to gather her strength. Josh, hurt by her words, pulled away abruptly. His face twisted with anger, and his voice sounded harsh. "You think you can just get rid of me, after everything we've been through?" Alice looked at him, feeling for the first time that she didn't recognize the man she had spent so much time with. There was something dark and menacing in his eyes that made her feel cold. "Josh, please," she said quietly. "I don't want it to end like this, but I can't live with these lies anymore." Josh silently turned away and left the house without a word. Alice was left alone in the darkness, and she felt that her whole life had lost its meaning. Later, when the night swallowed everything around her, Alice decided to go for a walk to think about what had happened. She wandered around the neighborhood, lost in thought, immersed in her own memories and reflections. She tried to understand where exactly she had made a mistake, why she had allowed such a gap between herself and her daughter. Suddenly, a sharp sound of footsteps came from around the corner. Alice turned around, feeling someone's presence, but it was hard to see anything in the darkness. She began to walk faster, feeling an inexplicable sense of danger rolling over her. The footsteps behind her were getting closer and heavier. She turned around just in time to see a shadow approaching. Fear gripped her. She took a step back, but suddenly felt a sharp pain pierce her. The world spun before her eyes, and the darkness swallowed her whole. The next morning, Alice's body was found on the side of the road, not far from her own home. The world of her luxurious life, her secrets and forbidden desires came to an end that night, leaving secrets that were now hidden even deeper. Whether it was a random attack or someone deliberately wanted to stop her story, remained a mystery. The investigation of the case now fell to the detectives, who would have to uncover not only who the killer might have been, but also the truth behind the glitter and wealth of the Johnson family. The morning at the Johnson home began with chaos. Police cars, crime scene tape, and many investigators filled the area near the house where Alice's body was found. The death of a woman who was one of the most influential people in the city shocked the community. No one could believe that this could have happened to her, and now the detectives had to uncover not only the causes of the tragedy, but also all the secrets she had hidden behind the facade of her luxurious life. The case was assigned to detectives Daniel Blake and his partner Rachel Price. Blake was an experienced detective who had seen many crimes, but this case seemed special to him. Rachel, young but ambitious, quickly proved herself to be intuitive, and together, they formed an effective tandem. Blake was known for his analytical nature, and Rachel for her ability to pick up on small details that others overlooked. When they arrived at the crime scene, Blake looked around carefully, trying to find at least some clues. Alice's body was lying on the side of the road, and although there was a look of horror on her face, her overall attire looked like she wasn't planning on leaving the house for long. It suggested that she might have gone out with someone she knew, or had no idea she was in danger. If this was a simple robbery, we would have seen things scattered or valuables missing, Blake said thoughtfully, looking at Alice's purse, which remained next to the body intact. Rachel, taking a notebook, carefully examined the area around her, noting unusual details. She noticed that there were faint boot prints on the asphalt leading to the road, but they broke off suddenly. Her suspicion grew when she noticed the way the footprints were arranged, as if someone had been in a hurry to get away. "Blake, look," she pointed to the footprints. "I think this might be important. It looks like someone was running away and fast." "Interesting," Blake nodded. Whoever it was obviously didn't want to leave any trace, but I doubt anyone would leave such a visible clue on purpose. Maybe it happened by accident when they could no longer contain themselves. Blake noticed Alice's expression. Something about it seemed unusual, as if she didn't realize what was happening until the last moment. This suggested that the attacker might have been someone she knew. The investigation had just begun, and the first people to be questioned were the immediate family members. Sophie, who had just suffered the shock of losing her mother, seemed devastated. Her face was pale, and her eyes were fixed on the floor. "Sophie, I know this is difficult for you," Rachel began, trying to calm the girl down, "but we need to know everything that can help us with our investigation. When was the last time you saw your mother?" Sophie was silent for a long time, trying to collect her thoughts. "Last night," she answered quietly. "We had a fight, and I went to a friend's house. I couldn't stay in that house anymore, not after everything that happened." "Can you tell me more about what happened between you two?" Blake asked. Sophie looked away, but answered. I found out about her relationship with my boyfriend, Josh. It was humiliating and hurtful. I couldn't forgive her, and to be honest, I didn't think I ever would. I told her I never wanted to see her again." Blake and Rachel exchanged glances. They seemed to have a motive that could lead to important conclusions. "Where was Josh during this time? Do you know?" Rachel asked, watching Sophie's reaction. Sophie shook her head. "I don't know. After that conversation with my mom, I didn't even want to see him. I don't know where he was or what he was doing. The investigators decided to talk to Josh, who Sophie said might have been the last person Alice spoke to that evening. When they arrived, Josh looked somewhat scared and confused. "Josh, we understand that this is a difficult time," Blake began, "but we need to know more about your relationship with Alice." Josh was silent for a few seconds, as if considering how to answer. His eyes darted from side to side, and Blake noticed that he couldn't look them directly in the eye. We were friends," he finally said. "Nothing special, just helping each other out." "But we understand that it was more than just friends," Rachel said. "We have reason to believe that you and Alice were having an affair." Josh tilted his head and exhaled, as if trying to collect his thoughts. "Maybe it was a mistake," he said quietly. "I did get attached to her, and we had feelings. But I didn't think it would lead to anything bad." Rachel watched his answers closely, paying attention to every gesture and intonation. She felt that Josh wasn't telling her everything, and this uncertainty only increased her suspicions. "Where were you the night of the murder?" Blake asked, his gaze calm but piercing. Josh swallowed nervously, his voice trembling. "I was at home. After talking to Alice, I came home and never left. You can ask my neighbors. They probably saw me." "We'll be sure to do that," Rachel replied, jotting down his answers in her notebook. Josh was silent for a moment, and his eyes darkened for a moment. "We may have misunderstood each other sometimes," he replied evasively. "But I'm not a murderer, if that's what you're implying." Rachel and Blake exchanged glances. Josh's answer was vague, but there was clearly something he was trying to hide. The detectives decided to examine the Johnsons' house in more detail, hoping to find new evidence. They noticed a locket that had been left on the living room table, and Rachel paid special attention to it. She picked it up and saw the word "life" engraved on it. It seemed like a trifle, but perhaps it had some connection to the motif that they hadn't yet realized. Later, while looking through Alice's things, they found a note left on her nightstand. It read, "We have to talk. This can't go on forever." There was no signature or further instructions. Blake speculated that the note might have been left by Josh, or perhaps someone else who knew about their relationship. Blake and Rachel continued to investigate the details, and with every step they took, a complex, intricate picture opened up. Each character in the story seemed to be confused about their motives, and each had their own secrets that were now coming to the surface. They realized that Alice's murder was not just an accidental tragedy, but the result of many betrayals, lies, and unspoken feelings that had been accumulating for years. Was her death the result of jealousy, or was it retribution for past mistakes? The detectives knew one thing: to find the truth, they would have to delve even deeper into the Johnsons' complicated life, where every little thing could be decisive. The investigation into Alice's murder was gaining momentum. Detectives Daniel Blake and Rachel Price had already learned quite a bit about her relationship with Josh and the conflicts it had caused in the family, but they realized that there was something much deeper behind the outer facade of this story, something that had eluded them so far. The morning the detectives returned to the Johnson home, they found Sophie trying to put her mother's things in order. She looked exhausted, and her face was pale and distant. "Sophie, could you show us your mother's personal belongings?" Blake asked. "It might help us with our investigation." Sophie nodded, and without a word, led them to Alice's bedroom. She opened the wardrobe, where the shelves were neatly laid out, and the makeup and perfume remained on the table. Rachel noted that everything looked almost perfect, as if no one had touched these things since Alice's death. Everything here seemed to preserve her image, her manners, and even her secrets. The detectives began to examine Alice's personal belongings, trying to find something that would help shed light on the motives for her murder. On the bedside table, they found a small notebook with notes. Opening it, Blake saw that it was a kind of diary in which Alice described her thoughts and feelings. "This could be important," he said, flipping through the pages. In one of the entries, Alice recalled her relationship with Josh. She described how he made her feel young again, and allowed her to feel passionate again. But at the same time, she noted that the relationship had become a burden that tore her apart. In some of the entries, there was a sense of uncertainty, as if she knew she was making a mistake, but couldn't bring herself to stop. One phrase caught the detective's attention. "I'm afraid my weakness will destroy me. I don't want Sophie to know the truth, but Josh. His jealousy is getting dangerous." It was a hint that her relationship with Josh had changed in recent days, and something dark was hovering over them. Rachel turned a few more pages until she came across an entry. "Josh promised he would never tell Sophie, but I'm not sure I can trust him. He's been different. I don't know what's affecting him anymore." These words made the detectives think about Josh's possible motives. His attachment to Alice may have been deeper than just an affair. Perhaps she awakened emotions in him that he could not control. Later that day, when Blake and Rachel left the Johnson home, they decided to talk to some of the neighbors to see if anyone had seen anything suspicious the night Alice was killed. The first neighbor, Mrs. Linda Mason, an elderly woman, recalled hearing some loud footsteps outside. "I don't know exactly what it was," she said, sounding a little nervous, "but it was in the middle of the night. At first I thought it was one of the kids having fun, but when I found out about Alice in the morning, it seemed strange." "Did you see anyone?" Rachel asked. "No, I didn't," Mrs. Mason sighed. "It was very dark. But to be honest, I thought I heard someone whispering, or speaking in a whisper. I don't know, maybe I was just imagining it." After talking to the neighbors, the detectives decided to visit Josh again, this time in his apartment. They wanted to know more about his attitude toward Alice in the days leading up to her death, and whether he was really hiding important details. Josh looked embarrassed when he opened the door, but he received them with cold politeness. "Josh, we found Alice's notes in which she described your relationship," Blake began, watching his reaction carefully. Josh lowered his head for a moment, then looked back at the detectives. "I was really attached to her," he said, "but she always pushed me away when I tried to get closer. Her words about jealousy, maybe she just didn't understand me. I wanted her to be with me." Rachel added, still vigilant. "She also wrote that she was afraid of you, Josh. What can you tell me about that?" Josh held his breath and was silent for a moment. "It wasn't fear," he replied, shaking his head. "She knew there were feelings between us that she was trying to hide. She knew I couldn't hide it from Sophie anymore." Rachel and Blake left his apartment with a heavy feeling that Josh was really hiding something. His answers were cautious, but there was something cold and distant about them. Later that day, the detectives returned to their station and began to carefully analyze all the evidence they had found. Alice's notes, the neighbor's testimony, Josh's behavior, it all added up to a tangled mess that they were trying to unravel. Rachel looked again at the locket they had found in the living room. It seemed like a small thing, but her intuition told her that it might have more meaning than it seemed at first glance. "You know, Blake," she said, holding the locket in her hands, "I think this locket might have been a gift from Josh to Alice. If so, he might have left it at her house as a token of his feelings. And if it was that important to her, then maybe it was left behind after one of their last dates," he said, thinking, which only confirms that their relationship had become more complicated before she died. The next morning, the detectives decided to interview Sophie again. They knew that her emotional state was still strained, but it was necessary to gather all the details. "Sophie, we need to ask you a few more questions," Rachel began as they sat down in her living room. Sophie nodded, her hands shaking, but she looked ready to answer. "Have you ever noticed anything in Josh's behavior that you thought was dangerous or aggressive?" Blake asked. "I never noticed any aggression," she replied after a pause. "But lately he's been strangely pushy. He said we should be together, but his words didn't always match his actions. He was very, very unusual." "What do you mean?" Rachel asked, leaning closer. "I don't even know how to explain it," Sophie said, shaking her head. "His eyes, his look. I suddenly felt like I didn't know who he really was." Sophie's words further strengthened the detectives' suspicions. Something in Josh's behavior was illogical and inconsistent, making them wonder if he could really forget about his feelings for Alice and leave her without any regrets. They decided to go back to the police station and put all the evidence they had found together to put the whole picture together. Something told them that the solution was close, but they would have to work harder to get to the truth. Detectives Daniel Blake and Rachel Price continued to analyze all the evidence and testimony they had found, trying to put the pieces together. They knew that they were only a few steps away from the truth, but they needed to carefully review every detail to finally understand who the real killer was and what led to the tragedy. Sitting in their small investigation room, the detectives laid out all the things they had found on the table. There were entries from Alice's diary, a medallion with the inscription "Life" left by Josh, testimonies from neighbors and friends, as well as testimonies from Sophie and Josh themselves, which turned out to be the most contradictory. Blake pondered as he looked at an entry in Alice's diary where she wrote that she was afraid of Josh and his unpredictable actions. "It's strange that Alice would leave these notes," he said, flipping through the pages. "On the one hand, she says she's afraid, but on the other hand, she can't break off the relationship." "It sounds like an internal conflict," Rachel said. "She wanted to be with him, but she felt he was becoming dangerous. That locket that says 'Life,' you know it's there for a reason." Rachel examined the medallion again, twisting it in her hands. It looked like a symbolic gift, but the detective's suspicions about Josh's motives did not disappear. Blake, meanwhile, recalled that Mrs. Linda Mason, a neighbor, had mentioned footsteps and whispers that night. It was a small whisper, but it indicated the presence of another person. "Do you remember what Mrs. Mason said about whispering and footsteps?" He turned to Rachel. Maybe Josh wasn't the only one who knew about the affair with Alice. It's likely that Sophie was also suspicious, and maybe even knew about everything that was going on. "That might explain her behavior during the interrogation," she said thoughtfully. "Her testimony was vague, but she mentioned Josh's strange looks. It was as if she knew more than she was willing to say." The detectives decided to talk to Sophie again, to find out if she could have been present when the tragedy happened. They summoned her for another interrogation, during which Blake immediately got to the main question. "Sophie, we want you to remember the night your mother died," he began. Sophie held her breath nervously, looking down. After a pause, she nodded. "Yes," she admitted in a small voice. "I came back later to talk to my mother. I thought I could understand why she did all this. But when I saw them together, I couldn't stand it. I wanted to run away, but I heard Josh whisper something to my mom, like he was demanding that she do what he wanted." "What did he say?" Rachel asked, watching Sophie intently. Sophie remembered the moment and said, "He said something like, 'You promised me,' and that he wanted her not to see me anymore. I was scared, and then I decided to run away. I didn't hear anything else, only how they started fighting. I was so scared that I just went home." This testimony made the detectives think. If Josh was actually trying to control Alice and wanted her to end her relationship with her daughter, this could be the reason for their conflict that night. The diary, the locket, Josh's strange behavior, and his jealousy all pointed to the fact that he wanted to control Alice completely, but when she realized that she couldn't go on like this, he decided to stop her. Blake leaned over the table, studying the locket closely and recalling each piece of evidence. "Rachel, I think Josh saw Alice as his property, and when she decided to end their relationship, it made him angry." "That explains his jealousy of Sophie," Rachel echoed. "Maybe he couldn't bear to lose Alice, and when she told him they had to break up, he decided to act." Detectives called Josh in for a final interview. "Josh, we know that your relationship with Alice has become a problem for you," Blake said, watching his reaction closely. "We also know that she wanted to end it, and you couldn't accept that." Josh nervously clenched his hands, avoiding the detective's direct gaze. "You don't understand. She promised to be with me, and then she just decided to leave me," he exclaimed, unable to control his emotions. "She was playing with my feelings, and when I asked her to choose me, she refused." "You threatened her that night," Rachel pointed out. "You demanded that she give up her daughter and be with you." Josh fell silent, and his face turned gray. He realized the detectives had learned everything. "She never really loved me," he whispered, clenching his fists. "She was just using me, and when I realized it, I couldn't forgive her." Blake leaned in closer, looking Josh straight in the eye. "And you decided that if she wasn't going to be with you, She wasn't going to be with anyone else. You killed her, Josh. Your jealousy, your greed, and your inability to control your emotions led to her death. Josh was silent, his hands trembling and his eyes clouded over. He lowered his head, realizing there was no point in denying it anymore. His rage and desire for control were what led to the tragedy. When the detectives arrested Josh, Sophie watched from the doorway of the house. Her eyes were filled with bitterness and pain, but she was no longer crying. Now she knew the truth and realized that her mother had not abandoned her, but had become a victim of someone else's manipulation and betrayal. After Josh's arrest, the process of preparing for the trial began. The trial was high profile. In the small town where Alice was well known, people actively followed the case, discussing the details of each day's hearings. Josh was tried for aggravated murder. His motive for the crime was jealousy, and the death occurred during a conflict that was a personal revenge. The defense lawyer tried to prove that Alice's death was the result of an accident, and that Josh did not intend to kill her. However, the prosecutors presented evidence of his intentional actions. The whispers heard by Miss Mason, the escalation of conflicts in their relationship, which were described in Alice's diary, and the testimony of Sophie, who recalled Josh's words that he would never leave Alice. Sophie became one of the most important witnesses in the trial. She told the court about the conflict between her mother, and Josh, as well as about the fateful evening when she saw Josh demanding that Alice take full control of her life and abandon Sophie. Her words were a painful reminder of the dark relationship that led to her mother's death. The court, taking into account all the circumstances of the case, found Josh guilty of premeditated murder. The judge announced the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of early release. The sentence reflected the seriousness of his crime and his motive, which was based on cruel manipulation and a desire to control another person. Sophie, who was present at the sentencing, heard the judge's words with indescribable pain. She realized that even though Josh would be punished, it would not bring her mother back and would not restore her torn family. She was left alone with a trauma of betrayal and loss that would never fully heal. The trial and sentencing left a lasting impact on the town. The story of Alice and Josh has become a tragic lesson for many, reminding us how jealousy and control can lead to catastrophic consequences. Sophie, having gone through deep pain and loss, decided to sell her mother's house and move to another city where she hoped to start a new life, leaving behind the shadows of the past.